I first met her while I was hiking to observe alpine plants, halfway along the descent route towards the cabin where I was planning to stay overnight. She was crouched at the side of the trail, looking unwell. She appeared to be in her late 30s, and she was radiant yet somber, a young widow. Again this week, seriously, my name is James, but around here, they call me Michael Thompson. I work as a researcher of alpine plants at the county museum. For 4 weeks in a row, when I told my wife, Michelle, that I was going alone to the mountains to observe alpine plants over the weekend, she'd reacted hysterically. It's part of my job, Michelle, there's nothing I can do about it. Back in college, I was part of the athletic club and was invited to go hiking by a senior member. The first mountain I climbed was about 6,500 feet high. I was captivated by a small wildflower known as the Queen of Alpine Plants that I saw at the summit of that mountain. I was fascinated by the small wildflower that had white and pink petals blooming on the rocky ground. Since then, mountain climbing became my hobby, and this passion led me to my job as a researcher of alpine plants. What do you say to Jacob? Jacob is our 6-year-old son. Michelle said that I will take him to the amusement park this weekend, as I've been postponing our promise to him. Why don't you just take him, Michelle? You're the one who told Jacob about the amusement park without asking me. Leaving those words behind, I left the house with my backpack. I planned to stay overnight at the mountain cabin, and I had already submitted my climbing plan. I would get to the trailhead by transferring between trains and buses. Is this what they call going through a rough patch? On my way, I recalled the argument with Michelle. It left a sour taste in my mouth. I arrived at the trailhead just after 9 a.m. While climbing towards the summit, I observed alpine plants. It was just after 3 p.m. On my way to the mountain lodge where I'd reserved a one-night stay, I ran into a woman who was sick. I escorted her back to the lodge and nursed her back to health overnight. After regaining her strength, we parted ways at the trailhead the next day. On a whim, I stopped by a local shop at the foot of the mountain and bought a souvenir, candies, for my wife and son for the first time. What's this? When I handed over the mountain treats, my wife, Michelle, looked at me in confusion. I called out to Jacob, who was in his room, telling him I'd brought back a souvenir. Having had his promise of a trip to the amusement park broken, Jacob, sulking, deliberately stomped his feet as he came over. Hoisting Jacob onto my knee, I told him, I swear I'll take you to the amusement park next weekend, for real this time. Really, really? Jacob asked, looking up at me. I'm not lying. Then, I opened the box of souvenir candies. Just as Jacob reached out his hand, Michelle interjected. No, you can't. Dinner is almost ready. After dinner, Jacob and I spent a short hour playing video games, took a bath together, and I put him to bed. When I returned to the living room, Michelle was watching the news on TV, seemingly bored. How about it, want a beer? I took a can of beer out of the fridge and offered it to my wife. What's gotten into you? Playing the doting dad all of a sudden, and now trying to be the loving husband. I grabbed 2 glasses and sat down across from my wife. Pouring the beer, I raised my glass for a toast. There's something I want to tell you. Something I need you to hear. Michelle took a sip of her beer and looked at me. I told her about the woman I met on the way to the mountain lodge, who was in poor health. I thought to myself, she's taking the mountain too lightly, dressed in casual clothes like that. But I couldn't just leave her there. So, I talked to the woman. Whether she was on a tour or lost from her group, she only replied that she came alone. I didn't tell Michelle this. but I was reminded of the look on that woman's face when she looked up at me after answering my questions. With her glossy hair tied back and a certain melancholy in her eyes, I was captivated by her. And then I had a thought. Alpine plants possess a unique beauty. The higher the altitude they inhabit, the more I perceive their beauty to intensify. I've wondered why this is, especially considering the harsh natural conditions of these high-altitude areas. After all, plants such as flowers perpetuate life by enabling the pollen from male flowers to fertilize the female flowers. This process necessitates the assistance of wind and insects. Wind is a force we can only leave to nature, but insects we can attract. Hence, flowers bloom. The fragrance and beauty of the bloomed flowers serve to attract insects, enlisting them in the process of pollination. I sensed something similar in her, the woman I encountered on my descent route. An allure that draws men towards her unconditionally. She said climbing in such light attire and getting sick, it's a nuisance, really, causing such a commotion. It's totally true. I considered taking her to the mountain cabin where I was supposed to stay. However, it was nearly an hour's walk from where I found her to the cabin, even just for me alone. So, what did you do? My wife asked with keen interest. Well, I recalled that there was a refuge cabin much closer, I replied. A refuge cabin is a mountain hut available for free to anyone encountering an emergency, such as bad weather. Most refuge cabins are unmanned, with no resident caretakers. And because they're free, some climbers use them as planned accommodation, even when it's not an emergency, which is allowed. I continued my story to my wife. Carrying the woman I'd found on the mountain trail, I walked for about 20 minutes and arrived at the refuge cabin. Along the way, the sky had turned ominous, the wind was picking up, and large raindrops began to fall. The cabin was empty. Well, looks like we're imposing ourselves here tonight. She nodded, arms wrapped around herself. Looking at her, I saw her lips trembling, tinged with purple. Cold, isn't it? That's what happens when you climb a mountain rest like that. I offered her my mountain jacket that I was wearing. When you go mountain climbing, it's basic to layer your clothing. That way, if it's hot, you can take layers off. If it's cold, you can put them on. Even when I tried to explain the basics of mountain climbing, she was miles away. Then I contacted the mountain hut I had booked, explained the situation, and said we would be staying in the emergency shelter that night. So what? You're telling me you two were alone together until morning? Silently, I nodded in response to my wife's question. And then, my wife, Michelle, spat out the words dismissively. I had brought food, drinks, and cooking utensils to the mountain hut we had booked because we planned to stay without meals. It was a bit scarce for two people, but I cooked dinner anyway. The menu was a classic instant curry. Still cold, I asked her, even though she didn't touch the curry I had made. As usual, she completely ignored me. Gradually, I began to feel irritated. Eat. If you eat, your body will warm up a bit. I don't want it. I thought she was finally reacting, but this was all she said. Still, her gloomy tone made me feel something was seriously wrong. I don't know what happened, but I sternly said to her, if I hadn't come by, your life might have been in danger. You shouldn't underestimate the mountains. But she just turned her sorrowful profile away from me and remained silent, not trying to speak. I thought I couldn't handle this anymore, so I figured all I could do was let her sleep. Did she not touch it after all? The curry you made? Yeah, she didn't eat it, I told my wife, as I grabbed another can of beer from the fridge. As night fell, the rain and wind became stronger. The sound of rain hitting the